I'm really looking forward to this panel. Best practices for harvesting innovation and breaking roadblocks. No one more adept at orchestrating this panel than George Telesh, the Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer for Global Affairs with Ipsos. And we have 4 esteemed panelists. We have Mohammed Ansari, Steve Barsh. Mohammed Ansari is the former SVP of LG Electronics. Steve Barsh with Dream Adventures. Boris Pluskowski, please. Pluskowski. I speak Russian. I should have known that. He's the managing director for Silicon Valley Bank. And last but not least, Carrie Tildes, SVP Corporate Strategy with FordDirect. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. The weight is great on our shoulders to be the first panel. Well, it's a great honor to be back here. For me, it's the 3rd time, and unfortunately, this seems to be the last one, at NASA at least. And I see many familiar faces and many friendships I made throughout the years. I hope that those of you who are first-timers will remember this community the same way as I do. Sometimes jokingly to myself, I call it the IA group, the Innovators Anonymous. Because this is not just a community of inspiration and knowledge exchange, but also sometimes it works like a support group or a group for commiseration of our challenges. One thing I learned here throughout the years is that many of the boundaries we perceive with industries are very much artificial when it comes to innovation, especially corporate innovation, which means that we share a lot more in common than we think. We have the same problems, almost the exact same problems. So our panel is actually very emblematic regarding that, I think. And when we were talking about choosing the topics for this panel, we said that we want to focus on a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes, a lot of best practices that may seem to come from one industry, but you will be surprised how much it applies to yours, actually. And we will be focusing on identifying some of the blockers that you are not aware of, or you may not be aware of, but focusing on the solutions, not just the blockers. So, as I have been introduced, I'm the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer for Ipsos Global Affairs. Global Affairs is a division which works with organizations that serve the public interest. So we are kind of like the social innovation arm of Ipsos, which is the top 3 research company in the world and the #1 innovator of the research industry. What I wanted to talk about as an Ipsos person, we are very much data focused. There are a few data points from my corporate innovation practice that I wanted to share with you. And hopefully they will frame the conversation that is coming. So one of the major data points that I like reminding people, and let me start with a quote that is coming from the chairman of BMW. Innovation is a willingness not to be understood for a very long time. And I think that the data point that I want to attach to this one is the role of boards in corporate innovation. So if you take a look at boards and board members, innovation is the top, is the number 5 priority of board members. About 30% of board members treat it as a priority, and new technologies and investing into new technologies is the number 7 priority of board members. And I will call the panelists to talk about that aspect of their work, because pretty much that kind of connection between management and the board when it comes to long-term innovation strategies is something crucial. The other data point that I wanted to add is about culture, and we will talk a lot about culture, actually, innovation culture. That seems to be the hardest, the most mystified, and the closest to what I define as the art of innovation and not the science innovation. So the cultural aspects is that I did a major study for the European Commission about 2 years ago, and one thing that we found on the innovation culture part in big corporations is that about close to 80% of corporate leaders defined having an innovation culture as a must-have and a need, but those who were actually admitting to doing something about it was about 30%. So there's a very big gap in that regard. The third data point that I wanted to share is about ROI. So 91% of big corporations are struggling with justifying return on innovation or ROI on innovation. And that's going to be another major topic of our discussion. Like, are we using classic definitions of ROI in the wrong way? And maybe we should have another definition like return on innovation, which is going much, much broader than the original ROI. And the fourth number and the last number that I wanted to share is that because most corporations are in one shape or another working with startups now. So corporate startup collaborations is another topic that we would like to talk about. And at the same study that I just referenced to you, there was also a big gap when we were asking corporations and startups who have engaged in collaboration with each other about their satisfaction index after the partnership ended or came to a conclusion, and there was a close to 30% gap. So corporations were way happier than startups at the end of the friendship or partnership. So these are the data points that I wanted to start with. Let's dive in regarding culture. Like, we know that innovation culture or the lack of innovation in culture, it's lots of innovation strategies for breakfast. What are your points regarding that, especially with the subset of building trust in an organization about delivering innovation strategies? Mohammed, for example, if you have any.
Yeah, I'm Mohammed. I ran a couple of R&D and innovation labs for large corporations in Silicon Valley. My recent experience was with a large foreign company, very diversified portfolio. The culture point that you're making, I think, and what Umar made as well, is very important to understand. A lot of very successful companies have a core business, or several core businesses, in case of my previous employer, that are very, very profitable. And the culture to create that kind of a scalable core business is around what I call downside management. It's about resource allocation, it's about process, and it's about repeating that process at a cheaper and cheaper cost. So the incentives that culture aligns or incentivizes their presidents of business units is really around that downside management. Here I am in Silicon Valley trying to create value. And value creation is a very different cultural and operational context. And these days, the linear business models of many companies, which is you take parts, you build products, and you ship them at a margin. We don't sometimes even know these days value is created by others, and you create platforms where others then come and create value. That's a very fundamentally different business model that needs a very different cultural approach, an incentive approach, and also a strategic approach that's different. So in my experience, almost every project that we ran into this process issue, incentivization issue. And so the way that we addressed it, one of the ways we addressed it was have an innovation portfolio approach, where you do some incremental stuff, you do some disruptive stuff, and you also then take some partial deliverables, or what I call core technologies, and you contribute back to the business unit on the short-term impact to the product. We'll talk about more of this. I'll give a chance to whoever is next to address this.
Carrie, Steve, Boris, to the cultural aspects.
With most large companies I've worked with, culture is their brand. It's part of their brand. And you can't take those two things and separate them for a larger company, especially companies that have been around for 100+ years. It's part of their brand. And so anytime you want to do something that's innovative, you have to actually think about how that affects their brand, not just their culture. Those two things are tied very much together. So you often see companies doing things that are innovative, that are on almost surface steps, because at the same time they're trying to build a culture of innovation, they're trying to amplify their brand and change their brand. And so if you can think about things that are innovative, frameworks, approaches, and structures that can help enable the brand, because that's where you'll win. Because if your process or approach or framework or idea is something so new that it might affect or risk the brand, culturally it won't be accepted. And I think we need to spend a lot more time on that too when you're talking about large companies. So when you bring a startup in, you might think, wow, this is really great, it's an idea, it'll be really inspiring to a lot of folks. But you really have to think about, so culturally it might be interesting, but if it is inversely affecting the brand, potentially, then you might have a problem out of the gate. So that's just one of the dimensions I think about when I think about culture and innovation and big brands and startups together.
So, maybe a little bit off the topic here. So I've been in the innovation space now for about 20 years. And over those 20 years, I can't say I've ever had anybody accuse the world of not spending enough money or time on culture, specifically on innovation culture. It seems to be the whipping boy every time that everybody fails. They're like, oh, we didn't have an innovation culture, and that was the big problem. The thing is that innovation culture, at least in my perspective right now, is kind of a red herring. We don't actually want a singular innovation culture across the company. In fact, in many ways, what we really want is to allow multiple cultures to exist within that organization, because ultimately, part of the problem that we've been facing over the last 20 years is that, we're trying to change organizations in a way that they can't be changed fundamentally because of everything that existed in order to get them there. Right? Scale exists because you are able to fixate on a formula of what works, and then you expand that exponentially. And everything in your business exists to essentially solidify and increase the volume and echo chamber, I guess, of that formula. It's how we get to a consistent customer experience, how we get to economies of scale. Everything we need for scale comes from fixating on that formula. And our bureaucracy, our processes, and our culture enable that. So inevitably, when we try to innovate against that, everything works against that change to say, nope, that's not how we do it, that's not what happens here, and that's why change never actually happens. It's also why 99%, I'd say, of innovation programs over the years have always done nothing more than just do incremental changes. And so what we really want is actually somehow to allow multiple cultures to exist within the organization that are appropriate for each of the different businesses that we're running. So I'll stop and let somebody else comment.
Thank you.
Can I
You wanna
chime
say-
in a
Yeah,
little
sure,
bit?
sure.
So I've come here multiple times, and I heard a story. You're talking about culture and innovation. You say some organizations have that feeling, or they seem innovative, and we'd say that NASA is probably pretty innovative when we're sitting here. Where's Omar in the room? Because if I get this story wrong, I don't know where he is. Say, oh, he's way in the back. Okay, he's dealing with coffee. Anyway, some of you here years ago, and they may have repeated a couple times, they talked about Apollo 13 and an innovation on Apollo 13 when all the crew were going to die. Does anybody remember? Okay, I just want to, if you don't remember, I want to share that story with you, because I think it's very important if we think about NASA has a culture of innovation. And the example that they used was, so if you saw the movie or remember the story, right? All the astronauts were going to die on Apollo 13. So NASA got a team together, and somebody spoke at this event years ago and talked about what it was like. We got the best engineers in the room. By the way, we also got artists and musicians as part of it, because we wanted to think orthogonally about the problem. And the end of the movie, I think the end of the real story, thank God, is everybody was okay. But everything was out of the box. Everything was just crazy. And NASA apparently a week or two later got everybody back together in a room and said, great, we solved it, congratulations, pat ourselves on the back. But NASA realized that in the last several years, those 3 days was the most innovative they'd been in years. And they said to themselves, and we're NASA, we're in the innovation business. Why was that? So I think what they talked about that we all know that's interesting when you're trying to drive innovation in a large organization is, I'm a big fan of necessity is the mother of invention. Nitmoy, right? They didn't have a choice wherever the sticker is around here. You know, failure's not an option, right? So it's really interesting for a big corporation. Can you drive innovation by taking certain teams, putting somewhat ridiculous constraints on them and saying, you know, you don't have 10 years and $10 million, you have, you know, 2 months and 100,000, something like that. But I just think it's interesting from a culture point of view, even for NASA, how do you push to that next level by massive constraints?
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. So let's move a little further on this path. There is an element with digital transformation or innovation that is basically the conundrum of connecting and transforming digital systems with human elements, and especially your existing ecosystems of customers and partners. And I think that Carrie has a great set of stories for us from the automotive industries, especially when it comes to dealerships and dealer relations and how to maintain the trust that you have built up as a legacy in the midst of disruption in your industry. Or can you?
For sure. So Forbes had an article somewhat recently. My attorney, our general counsel, reminded us of the least trusted jobs in the U.S. The number one least trusted job in the U.S. is a congressperson, congresswoman, congressman. So number two is a car dealer. She was very proud of the fact that number four was an attorney when she was pointing out this fact to us. And I say that because our number one challenge we need to solve in the automotive space is consumers not trusting car dealerships, number one. Number two, the second thing is data. In 2020, 90% of the new cars that are going to be on the road will be connected. So that's not in 5 years, that's next year. And so we are on the eve of a significant amount of data. We already have a significant amount of data, but we're on the eve of even more data. So when you put a lot of data, a moving vehicle, safety, personalization, and distrusted car dealers in a room, you have a huge opportunity for innovation and also failure. And the dealers know this. Now, the biggest point you were making is the dealers' primary way they do business is that they're a human system first. They are human first. The entire car shopping and even service experience is underpinned by several fragmented, disconnected systems and data. But the system itself that serves millions and millions of customers is human. Now, I just said we're on the eve of significant amounts of data where the machine will be smarter than the system, the digital system. It'll be smarter than the human system. So how do you connect all of these worlds together? And this is what we're working on, and this is what our dealers are working on. They now understand that instead of having a probabilistic or a predictive approach to the fact that your car needs an oil change, we can tell you exactly how many days left you have in the oil life of your vehicle. We can tell you that. And our job is to take those types of opportunities today, not in the future, and how do we connect that and enable a human system to serve a customer? And that word serve is really important. Because if they don't serve the customer, you saw the stats with Omar and AI, machine learning, automation, self-service, et cetera, they won't have a business if they're not in the business of serving their customers with that human element. So it's a really challenging problem to solve. We're working on it. We're working on connecting the data in more meaningful ways through the entire experience. It's been an incredible journey. And the human and digital system is the key. How do you connect those two systems in a meaningful way to serve? So I can go for hours on this topic, but I know you told me not to.
I didn't tell you, but
Yes, you
we
suggested.
have time watchers. Anybody else on that topic of transforming your ecosystem partnerships, dragging your customers along your digital transformation or being pushed by your customers for digital transformation?
I can talk about a couple of stories that I faced as part of innovating for a large company. The innovation organization was really cut off from the mothership, from the core businesses for a reason. So there was some decoupling that allowed us that freedom. At the same time, the problem really was that either we are going to go work on an area that the business units did not understand at all, which meant you almost have to spin off something. And what I faced and realized that spinning off requires a very different set of employees and mindset. People who joined our lab are coming for working for a large company and taking risks without losing a paycheck. So that was one challenge. The other challenge is the executives in the business units, they did not want to take big risks because they only were concerned in the next 2-3 years of how they're going to get their bonuses. And so the question was really, if you end up going to even adjacent areas, which the business unit kind of understood, but it was not their core area, but they were willing to open their minds to that, is how do you get that external validation where the core competency in the company didn't exist or even in our lab. So we found a healthy balance of partnering with other large companies who made sense to partner with or who were interested in that channel or in that market. But nobody independently wanted to take that risk. But together, we could mitigate the risk. So partnership in that sense became an alternative mode of trying out new products. Of course, there was always all kinds of IP issues, all kinds of equity issues. One of the lessons I've learned in the last 4 years of running an innovation and a software lab is that most of our innovation projects, really the challenge has always been around go-to-market, channel, product market fit, less about engineering. The engineering problems we can solve, or we can partner with great minds in Silicon Valley to solve. The biggest problem comes, how do you get this product out? And one example for us was, we realized very early on that if your channel strategy was not thought out, it's amazing how in today's world, even the channel strategy informs product development and product scope decision. We were working on a product that this company was not in this market. The product and the core technology they were really good at, but the market was enterprise. And you could build a product so that it's a CIO sale, or you can build a product so it's an IT manager or a department sale. And they're very different variables that you have to consider from a user experience perspective, from a price perspective. And those problems sometimes, you don't have the resources in our R&D lab to address. You don't have the resources in the business unit because the business unit is very, very sensitive to getting their existing value chain or existing supply chain disturbed. Because you're going to try a different model of monetization. And so they're very averse to disrupting their current channel, right? So it's a very tricky balance to get that right.
So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Silicon Valley Bank. It's a super interesting organization in itself. Sort of best known, I guess, as being the de facto bank for the innovation economy. The bank is behind essentially about 50% of all the venture-backed startups in the US and about 70% of the VCs themselves. Where that actually puts us in a really weird position is that we're frequently banking our competitors. Or the up-and-coming disruptors within our space. And that puts us at a really interesting angle, trying to figure out, what do we actually do? Do we respond? Do we not? Do we look at them? Do we not? Do we, how do we actually drive that? At the same time, we face very similar problems here. We don't have resources inside, and also we realize that we don't have the capabilities inside to do it properly. And so we very much look to the startup world as essentially our solution for innovation in that ways. And actually one of the most interesting aspects, and that's sort of, or vendor classes, should I say, that have emerged over the last 2 years, and one that we're quite heavily leaning on right now is the whole concept of venture studios and venture builders that are out there essentially building startups on spec for us in order for us to be able to fully explore new concepts without the sort of risk or worry that the existing business will A, take its eye off the ball of being the best bank it can be, and then B, also not rejecting the fact that we're also looking quite frequently at things that are remarkably different from the traditional banking space. I mean, just as an example, we recently launched a company called Vouch that does startup insurance for startups, essentially. Completely different to anything we've looked at beforehand. But at the same time, we could never have built that internally. But by using a venture studio and a couple of former employees that we put into the equation now, that is a viable business that is out there being explored. And at a certain point in time, when and if they become successful, then we always have the option of being able to bring them back in-house. But they are far more successful because they're external and able to follow their own product roadmap and their own development path than if we tried to, in any kind of way, to build that internally.
So let's stay on the topic of corporate startup collaborations because they're very, very tricky. I think like last year or 2 years ago when we were discussing this, I brought the example of South Park when whether a pig and an elephant can mate with each other. It's sometimes the same. So when we were talking about corporate startup collaborations this morning, Steve had a pretty vocal opinion on the viability of these partnerships. So let him talk about it.
Okay. So let me just give you a little bit of background before I make some comments, kind of off the record, I think, although it looks like we're streaming. Yeah, exactly. I'm Steve Barshon. I'm a managing partner of Dreamit Ventures, and we're a venture fund. My background's computer science and software engineering, and I've been a serial entrepreneur my entire career. I've done so many startups, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I know which I enjoy more. So I work with a lot of startups from around the world, and we invest in a lot of startups in 3 sectors. And we've worked over the years with a number of corporations that want to do things with Dreamit, like, we want to run an acceleration cycle in health or an acceleration cycle in security, and would you come in and help us? And we've stopped doing that. Now, that's a hard choice for us. Techstars does it to the, they launch another one every week. The reason why we stopped doing it was we saw a lot of innovation theater, startup theater, where, you bring startups in and it's a bright, shiny object and everybody gets really excited. And it can be kind of good for the startups, and sometimes they get something out of it. We just see with the corporations, not much happens. Everybody gets excited. It's a little bit like, and I don't mean to see if I can bash everybody all at once, but it's like when we see corporations doing corporate venture capital. Some corporations do CVC, corporate venture capital, extremely well. I guess my question is, if people are working with startups or doing corporate venture capital, the question I always ask about every situation is, what problem are you trying to solve, and what's your definition of success? So you're partnering with startups, and you're successful if what happens? Usually, and I'm sure we've all seen this, 3 years into them starting working with startups or doing corporate venture capital, 3 years in, they shut it down, and we say, why'd you shut it down? We weren't successful. Well, how were you measuring success? Yeah, we never figured that out, so it wasn't successful. So we see, I can stop there, I can keep going, but that's just a little bit. And we still do a lot of work with corporate partners. They look at our startups all the time. There's nothing formal, but they look at our startups because they're cutting edge. And they look at them because they're startups that are solving specific point problems that they have.
Let's just stay on this topic so Boris can talk a little bit more about that. But I want to talk more about metrics. I raised the 91% scary high number of organizations struggling with innovation ROI. So how should we measure that kind of success? What are any kind of best practices that you have seen either at your companies or elsewhere to measure innovation?
Yeah, I faced that because I was also responsible to get the funding for the lab. And that was a very, very political process, and also partly metrics-driven process. And like I said earlier, the best solution that I found in this company was having a portfolio approach. There were certain things we did that were short-term, where the BU can pick up components or technology component, mostly software, to augment their current R&D efforts within the business unit. They would fund that. The UX that they would put on top of that product would be theirs because they understood their market and their segment. So that metrics was pretty well understood. You're giving a platform component. that was used across various business units on various products, and you tax them for that, or maybe we even had a royalty arrangement where we would get recurring revenue from the sales that the business units made. This lab that I worked for was a corporate lab, under CTO. The other metrics we really had, which was very hard to quantify, was my definition of innovation is really efficient learning. And how do you quantify efficient learning? Well, you could say, look, we did so many POCs, or we had 10 hypotheses that we validated or invalidated, but nobody's really interested in that, right? Because how do I make money? You're just testing things out and you're just playing around. Getting that budget, which was about 20-25% of our overall budget, was extremely difficult because there were always projects within the company that existed because some customization was needed by some customer. And so, again, the point I was trying to make was culturally, if your core business are about resource allocation, and that's how you galvanize and organize your work, then efficient learning cannot get that kind of resource allocation. So that's something that we did, and that relied on giving incremental results, quarterly updates, getting people to understand that this lean startup model that we are working with, we are going to have some milestones, and those milestones are either going to be, help in the short term by you picking up a core technology out of that, or that we do a partnership opportunity with someone, or an IP that we create. But it was a hard thing to kind of quantify. The totally disruptive stuff was really, we started out an innovation garage program that was all about just focusing on new experiences and things that we did not really know anything about, meaning, I would say, category-defining projects. And category-defining projects is not for every company, because not every company is interested in the prize that comes by defining a successful category, which is setting the price. Most companies would rather get away from that and be a fast follower. And somebody take the risk of establishing a category, and I'll come and create some opportunity either by cutting the price or by changing the business model a little bit, right? So for us, the disruptive innovation really ended up becoming a pure R&D effort. We did a few projects, for example, on how we could do gestures with millimeter wave. A few years ago, Google had a similar project where deep learning networks were designed to understand what the movement is and what it means. And so they became sort of one of those things that we did to get the core capabilities of the organization a leap forward, so that it's not incremental steps, but building the first neural network within this organization came out of this lab. And this was 3 years ago. So that was sort of took a capability or building the resources for the future. And that is a little bit acceptable by the CTO organization because that's their mission. Their mission is to make those leaps in technology.
So I've run accelerators for large brands in my past, not in this job. I've run accelerators that were videoed at CES for Nestle and Kimberly-Clark. That was what you described. It was visible learning, exposure learning. And then quiet accelerators, where it literally was on an ideation platform. You created a value exchange. You created a contest, which has all sorts of sweepstakes rules that you have to have with the value exchange. The best example of innovation, I think, with startups comes from taking the value exchange down a couple notches. The most recent example is asking the startups to not travel to see us, putting them all just on WebEx. And it's uncomfortable for everybody to do that, but no one's spent any money. Talk about their perspective of what the marketplace means, and then how they are disrupting the marketplace, and that's it. And there's very little investment on their part, And what the value is we get is marketplace intelligence. And so when you're working with startups, especially if you're a larger company, if you at the very least value them as marketplace intelligence and partners, and the value exchange they get from you is how to navigate a complex organization, or maybe things they didn't think about they need to develop for their product, a back-end UI, an administrative panel, things like that, and you only promise that, then I think you have a better opportunity for success when you're just authentic in that early value exchange. Than kind of the on-stage, on-camera, razzle-dazzle, which is important if that's part of the brand, if that's what the brand's trying to achieve. But that's few and far between. The real innovation happens when you can just have an authentic value exchange.
So, Steve, I mean, I'd like to say I agree fully with you, right? I mean, the vast number of times we see corporates coming in and just doing nothing more than theater. It's primarily because they think that just going out and interacting with startups is a strategy. It's not. And the absence of having a strategy isn't the strategy in itself, right? So you can go and do the activity, but without knowing what you're actually trying to do with it, it's going to be a useless endeavor no matter what you're trying to track or what you try to do. Just to give you an example of somebody who does it the exact opposite way to most, we do a lot of work with MetLife right now. Several times a year, I get a spreadsheet from them, usually about 150 to 170 lines long, with here's the business unit that's looking for a startup. Here's the problem they're looking for. Here's whether or not it's budgeted or just strategic and when it's budgeted for. That is a very different proposition to working with them and being able to go to a startup and saying, hey, you guys should go and speak to MetLife because this is a real opportunity here. That is a very different conversation, right? And this is in addition to everything else they do outside of that. It's chalk and cheese between the companies that are going in there with a strategy, knowing what they want to achieve, knowing how they want to achieve it, than it is to just go and touch startups. Everybody touches startups. Half the reason why, some of the Techstars stuff, and I shouldn't say that because we're an investor in Techstars, but just an NASA, right? They fail when again the corporate goes in there saying that this is going to be their main way of interacting with startups. They just do this very broad accelerator without very targeted needs and requirements at the other end of it. Inevitably, you're just doing nothing more than doing what a suggestion box used to do in the early days, and it's just a scattergun approach, right? You never know what's going to come out, and maybe you find something of use, but probably not. It's hard to be successful like that.
So let's talk a little bit more. I don't know how much time do we have, but I have 2 minutes. Okay. So we will not talk about AI then. Okay. God damn it. 5 minutes. Okay, 5. Perfect. So, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the hardships of being an entrepreneur, because there are many people, even in this room, who have been hired into corporate innovation roles from being entrepreneurs themselves before, founders themselves. Many of us share this similar background. So, when you encounter situations when, you have to explain a lean startup model and it's clashing with traditional product development models, or any other clashes, do you guys have experiences that's also covering the cultural aspect and anything, but advice for entrepreneurs who are fresh to their roles? Basically, that's the question. Entrepreneurs, sorry.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest lesson I learned, I was heading a lab that was an acquisition by this large company. Culturally, it was a very different place. Is that you need to be first very, very clear on what is the context that you're communicating to your team and what are the expectations you're setting with the top leadership. And that's a function of how you build the relationship internally, and the credibility really comes from execution. One of the points that you were talking about engaging with startup, one of the advantages I had at least was that business development, UX design, software, and product management were all under one roof. And so when we engaged with startup, we had a strategy on where are the core pieces that we think the business needs to take control of and internally build, and what are the pieces that we need with a partner or that are not important for us to own. And so, again, my advice to anyone who's doing this journey within a large corporation is, one, you have different stakeholders, your own team. If you're in Silicon Valley, people do not necessarily believe in resource allocation. You have to inspire them with a context, with a vision, with an experience, with a promise, and then they'll come and work with you. Large corporations usually don't work that way. And so it's all about resource allocation, right? So you have to bridge that gap. You have to explain the context to the executive who's going to give you the check. But you have to make sure that the experience is not so compromised on that effort that your product development team is not motivated at all to work on it, right? And this is one of the biggest problems I faced, because Silicon Valley has really, really a lot of good choices for engineers and product managers and UX designers to go. If you don't give them the right vision and the right context, they won't stay with you. And so that balance between motivating the team and setting the right expectations is extremely important in corporate.
Almost out of time, 30 seconds.
Sorry.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I would say the advice is get your own house in order first. Do your homework. For us, it's about getting the data organized and preparing for when you do the tests, that you have the right data and insights to prove what you did. For us, it's about small steps to explaining things. If we showed the whole vision to folks, that might scare them. So small steps and incrementality is really important. Too much of the sausage making is scary for them. And finally, just be authentic and build trust and earn your trust by doing the work. Slideware is vaporware, and that's death in innovation.
So entrepreneurship programs have always been kind of a weird thing for me, having built a couple of them before in the past too. I always keep feeling like if you really had entrepreneurs inside your organization, they wouldn't be inside your organization. And so inevitably, you're going to get, and I don't say this in a bad way, but second-class talent at best, right? Because you're getting people who aren't used to or even willing to take that kind of a risk needed in order to sort of truly achieve something interesting within that organization. Or you're looking for like really crazy outliers, right? People who shouldn't have been there to begin with, and you're just saying, hey, you really want to be outside. The tips I would do is, if you do go down that route, to make sure you give that person essentially the feeling of being outside your organization and resource constraint and everything else that a startup has. Put them in a WeWork somewhere away from your business, get them out of the building, and give them very little money as a starting point. One program I will tell you, it's kind of doing it a little bit differently. Just Fidelity, I don't know if you know, their incubation program I think is awesome, right? They actually get external entrepreneurs, bring them into the building for a year, put them on a contract, I think at around $250K for the year. Their whole gig during that year is build a startup that will solve one of Fidelity's problems, and then with the goal afterwards of spinning it out afterwards. I think that is more the right way to sort of do entrepreneurship, using people who are actually trying to build startups, not sort of try to change if you can, well, yeah, the business belongs to them. Yeah, absolutely. They need all the risks. There's like another hour-long conversation we can have on the challenges HR has in these things, but yeah, there's
I'm done. He's
right.
So thank you very much for your attention. A big thank you to all the panelists.
One moment.
Yeah.
We'd actually like to open up to the audience for one golden question.
Wow,
So if
okay.
you could direct that question
Sweet.
to one of our panelists for the sake of time. Would you mind if I...
Shoot.
One question.
A lot of what you addressed today has been addressed in the past by Skunk Workers Operations, Xerox PARC, and obviously the book Innovator's Dilemma. Do you think some of the problems defined in those books and the potential solutions don't really apply today? Because it seems like a lot of what you talked about is what really addressed those issues addressed years ago.
Who would you like to respond to the question? Okay.
So it has been addressed in parts over the years, absolutely. What we're starting to see now is increasingly a different form of organization popping out that addresses it actually changes the very format of what it means to be an organization, and I think that's how innovation is finally starting to become more successful. But it involves reinventing what an organization actually looks like to begin with. It means going outside of the traditional way of looking at yourself as a single company with a single HR and a single culture and a single everything into being more of a growth platform upon which multiple autonomous businesses are being built off of. That changes innovation out of what has, over the years now, become predominantly a problem-solving process into being much more of a business-building process. And as a business builder, then that becomes an entirely different game for us. Right now, we can sort of approach the build-buy-partner sort of scenario with a very different outlook. We can now start utilizing the startup ecosystem as an alternative proxy for the front-end portion, which has always been the big failure point for us, right? Because nobody ever likes the failure rate of of the early stage. Right? It's never been a good thing for us. But now there are, something like 300 million startups out there at any one point in time. Chances are, whatever it is you're trying to build is already in some piece or part already being built out there. So it just becomes a much more efficient process to reutilize what's out there rather than trying to compete against that. What that also allows you to do now, especially if you push the autonomous piece of all these businesses, is now be able to explore multiple different businesses at a time, and in an ideal format, whilst your core business is getting disrupted, your new business is already in your portfolio, and you don't care anymore because it becomes a net zero loss. That's how you get past the innovator's dilemma to begin with. I'm seeing more and more of those organizations popping up now, and it's obviously started a lot in the digital world. I mean, you see that in the pharma industry as well. Alphabet structured like that, Amazon structured like that, but I'm starting to see that in traditional businesses now too. And so I have no doubt that's kind of the way it's probably all going for me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your attention. Just one request to the organizers that we almost became business frozen as a panel. So if you could change a little bit the air conditioning to be a little bit less cold, that would be lovely. Because I care about the government innovation panel, Molly and Hondo dearly. So the floor is theirs.
Thank you so much to George and our esteemed guests.